think about Cold War, what do we think about? A lot of times, from my point of view, a lot of barbed wire, because you got East and West Berlin. Space race. We all experienced the different, very much competition in the Olympics there. That's a picture from the Tokyo Games. The Russians got first and second. We got third. Obviously, the nuclear threat and the worries about that, the H-bomb. And then the fall of the Berlin Wall, you know, that happened in the 90s. And if you recognize, you know, James Bond there with the Cold War, a lot of, some with the Cold War and some with the organizations trying to start a Cold War. You know, those are some of the memories we may have. So when you look at that, Russia obviously is the big part. And this is a quote from Churchill, "A riddle wrapped in a mystery inside of an enigma." Now he used that term in '39 in a speech or a radio address, I guess, you know, talking about Russia right when World War II started, because Russia was on the other side. They didn't necessarily declare them as an enemy, okay, but they definitely wasn't friends of France and Great Britain at that time because of the Nazi-Soviet pact, which we'll talk about. So the picture you see right here, that was the royal family. The Tsars had ruled Russia for 12 centuries. And Russia was a very diverse country, lots of ethnic groups. And for all that time, the monarchy tried to weld that together. But just like a lot of other countries, industrialization, migration, a lot of the causes of World War I. But World War I was catastrophic for Russia because they basically they lost their portion of World War I. In 1917, the Germans conquered them. And I'll talk about some of the subtle ways they made that happen. One of the ways was to send this guy back to Russia to start the revolution while World War I was going on. But communism, where did communism come from? Okay, Karl Marx, he wrote, he was lived over in England, and he wrote Das Kapital, and him with another person named Engels. So they were the father of this idea of communism. And one of the key things in communism is that he felt that was the science of where the world was going, okay? And capitalism was just a passing fad that dealt a lot with the industrialization that he experienced because he lived in that time period of the late 1800s. So, workers and leaders, atheist, and then a big important was subservience to the state. So workers had a place, they needed to be led, and it wasn't that big of a deal to have the leaders getting compensated for what they were doing, and the workers needed to be happy with what they were doing. So this person, Lenin, he would be, you could say, the father of Russian communism. And a lot of times these guys used Das Kapital as a framework, but to a point you could say they made it up as they went a little bit, as they went along. So Leninism is what they developed as a way to govern the big state of Russia, okay? And he was critical to the revolution. He was actually he was actually under, I don't know if it's house arrest or prison over in Germany, and they basically released him, sent him on a train, and sent him to Leningrad, and then he started the revolution. And then shortly thereafter, the Tsarist armies collapsed, and they had the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk, and then that ended the war on the Russian front during World War I. And the Germans were able to send 1 million men back over into France and almost defeated the Allied, Great Britain and France and the U.S. So Russia played a key part in World War I. This guy here, Joseph Stalin, once Lenin died in the 20s, Joseph Stalin, he was called the boss. And if you ever want an example of someone who is a very, you could say, cold-hearted, ruthless, no conscience, megalomania, Stalin's your guy, okay? Some of the things, if you look in this picture here, if you can see that, but there's Stalin right there. This guy right here, Leon Trotsky, he was sort of a competitor with Stalin. Once Stalin took over and eliminated a lot of people in his way, Trotsky had to flee, okay? But as a note, Stalin had him hunted down and he died in Mexico with a ice pick through his head. So Stalin was pretty ruthless. And you just have to remember the type of communism they had. It's totalitarianism, and Stalin was in charge, and he put people under him that wanted to be in charge too. So we talk about Nazism and all the people there, and it had all led it up to the Fuhrer. Well, Stalin was about as bad, you could say. Okay, so they had their civil war, the Reds versus the Whites. We actually tried to support the Whites by sending troops for about 8 months up to Archangel and Vladivostok up there, and we sort of got involved a little bit. Not a whole lot of troops, but you can see some of the cartoons here. That shows Father Lynn sweeping Russia clear of all these outside influences, including the church. This cartoon right here, that's not a parody, that's realistic. What's that saying is that, okay, when they took over, they tried to get rid of the Orthodox Church, and they burned a lot of churches with the clergy inside. So a lot of ruthless things happened during this revolution. We talk about, I don't want to get into Ukraine now, but Ukraine, there was a lot of starvation because Ukraine's a agricultural area, a lot of it, at least back then, it was a lot. And there was a lot of collectivization of farms and everything. Part of that, the rapid industrialization. So any person or group standing in the way was either killed, starved, or sent to the gulags in Siberia. Some of this got out to the Western press and information and stuff. You can see some tidbits here and there, but a lot of that was behind the scenes. So Stalin started to be in charge about, I think it was like 23. Right after World War I, the Polish, they got their own state through the Versailles Treaty and everything, and the League of Nations, and they invaded part of the Soviet Union at that time, but they ended up losing that part of the war, and that set the borders between Ukraine and Poland at that time, and the Baltic states. Bottom line is USSR, to form it into the state that it was, a lot of deaths, okay? But from their point of view, that was what was necessary to pull the country together and to form the communist state, okay? Another thing that the USSR did at that time, they had something called the Comintern. And so just like they had their own revolution, they wanted to foment revolution in other countries. So they had different representatives into different countries between World War I and World War II, and they were actively trying to recruit communists and actively trying to be a force in trying to get revolution in other states, especially in Europe. They were active in the Spanish Civil War. This picture right here shows a soldier clearly in a Russian uniform during the Spanish Civil War. Now Franco won that. The groups that Russia supported, they lost that Spanish Civil War. Now, since Stalin was in charge during the late 30s, they had different purges. So however they figured out who was doing something wrong. They weren't really discriminatory about that, but there were over 700,000 killed during 1936 and 38. And then later there was, on the latter part of that, that included the military purges. If you understand World War II and a lot of the things on the Russian side of it, there was a big purging of military generals right before the war started. So that sort of tells you the people in charge in Russia, they really didn't have to have any courts, justice, anything like that, the rights of the individual. That wasn't really part of what the USSR was. So that's fundamental to try to understand things that later led to the Cold War. Now, the Western culture, we're not perfect. We have a history of imperialism. During the 1800s, late 1700s, that's a picture of, between Britain and France, Napoleon carving up the world, okay? That's where, the British Empire. But by the time of going after World War I, World War II, democracies, individual rights was prime Christian influence on our government and how we looked at the government being run, basically. Capitalism has its own, you could say, dark side too. There was a lot of, obviously, excesses, and that's where the unionism and the Labor International came in. And there was some, part of that, whether the Comintern tried to support, communism in some of the labor unions, you can make an argument there, but some of the ideals that you needed unions to offset the industrialists and to support the workers, that was a valid thing going on in Western culture too. Obviously, the Great Depression, American isolationism, and we did have somewhat of an open journalism, so a little different than what on the Russian side of things. The average Russian, did they know what really was going on within their own country? They were more living in fear of whether they would be sent off or starved or something like that, So, World War II. A couple things about World War II. The Nazi-Soviet pact was a big deal. Okay, you can make the argument that with the economic agreement, the dividing up of spheres of influence between Ribbentrop, Molotov through Hitler and Stalin, you could say that was one of the things that started the war. It gave Hitler the green light to invade Poland. Okay, and an interesting, talk about it down here, we'll talk about down here a little later, but it's interesting how with Poland, World War II started with Poland, and through a lot of the things that went on that we'll talk about, and then also even at the end, you could say the end of the Soviet Union happened in Poland too, with Lech Walesa and everything. And it's sort of interesting, Poland being there, being so critical from the beginning and the end. Nazis attacked Russia in 1941. The Russian front was a big deal. It was a huge conflict, and the basically destroyed the German army when it was all said and done. Really made it in 1944. Made it the ability for the British and the American that we could come in and then conquer Nazi Germany at that time. Lend-Lease. When you talk about our support for Russia, one thing you got to realize, 11.3 billion went to the USSR, so that's almost 250 billion, and it was critical to defeating Nazi Germany. So the Lend-Lease, us becoming allies with Russia, was critical in Russia being able to win on the Eastern Front there. A lot of that Lend-Lease was raw materials. Without those raw materials, they couldn't make all the tanks and planes and supply it with fuel and different things like that. So Lend-Lease was critical. And another what was another quote from Churchill when he was talking about being in Churchill never did like Russia too much, and I think the quote was about if the devil was against Nazi Germany, he would at least make a favorable reference to him, which sort of implied that it was a reluctant alliance with Russia at that time, between Russia and Great Britain. So Poland, where the war started, British had Polish army troops. They equipped them. USSR actually had their own massacre of Polish prisoners in '39 before Germany invaded. And then the Warsaw Uprising happened in '44, and that was one way for the Russian army coming in to eliminate a lot of Polish people that were probably going to be in the the government after liberation and everything. And the Soviets had their own Polish home army and government. So we'll talk about the Yalta and Potsdam conferences, where there were some agreements made on who was going to govern Poland after the war. Now, the Soviets captured Berlin and liberated the huge tract on the Eastern European countries: Hungary, Bulgaria, Romania, Poland, Baltic states. So this is all leading up to tensions down the road. Some of the things in the Yalta and Potsdam conferences. In the Yalta conference, you still had Roosevelt and Churchill. So a lot of agreements that were made there. Roosevelt was very keen on getting the Russians into the Pacific War, because we were still fighting the Japanese at that time of the Yalta Conference, and also in the Potsdam Conference, that was one of the key themes there also. But the Potsdam Conference was still in 1945, but you've got Attlee that came in, and Winston Churchill got voted out of office, okay? And then you've got Truman, because in April, FDR had died. So you've got two new players on the scene, and you also got two new players up here that were involved in the negotiations. Mr. Bevan here, he was part of the Labor Party, staunch unionist, but very anti-communist. Okay, so it was an interesting play during these conferences, and then afterwards in other negotiations between him and Molotov. They didn't like each other, not at all. So during those conferences, they agreed on how to divide up Germany after the war. Like I said, there was a priority of getting the Soviets to enter the war with Japan. So a little tidbit of information, the Soviets were neutral with Japan during the whole war, okay? And one of the reasons, it's like, well, why didn't they try to attack Japan sooner? Well, you got to remember, half of all the tonnage over the whole war coming through on Lend-Lease was coming through the Pacific in Vladivostok, was where that was all coming in. And if they wanted that Lend-Lease from us, and you had Soviet ships, within so many hundreds of miles of the Japan home islands, supporting their war effort, and you think, well, how, the Nazis and the Japanese, they were all, allied, but a lot of the war material that was helping the Soviets defeat Germany, was half of it was coming just right past the doorstep of Japan. So they were neutral that whole time. British, their influence was, they were basically broke pretty well by the end of the war. So, but what Churchill and also Attlee's, their focus was on having free elections, in the liberated countries. USSR was interested in having buffer states. Okay, when you look historically, USSR, they've been invaded twice in the same century, and it was critical that they would have a lot of space between anybody in Europe that would want to try to invade them again. Okay, so you can see here on the map, these are the 4 occupation zones. This is where Berlin's at, inside the Soviet zone, and Berlin itself is divided up into 4 separate occupation zones too. That's the way that was set up. You've got Poland over here, but Poland was given most of East Prussia over there, and then Stalin actually wanted the part of Poland that he took from Poland when they invaded when Poland was at the very beginning in 1939. And that was part of the treaty he had with Hitler, that they would take that territory. And so he still wanted to keep that, and they allowed him to do that. And then this used to be Germany. Well, that then became Poland. So these are the borders, and this would be future West Germany right here, and this would be future East Germany. And then part of the agreements was that they wanted to form the United Nations, and that was another, I guess, compromise to the USSR. They really wanted the USSR in the United Nations. So that's why some of these things were, you could say, negotiated and given to Russia. Okay, so shortly after the war, and there was a lot of devastations through all these countries here. Obviously, Germany was devastated. Italy had its share. France was devastated with a lot of the fighting through the Low Countries there and everything. So one of the things that was going on also is that Russia was doing a lot of getting industry and shipping it back to Russia. That was one of the things that they were doing, war reparations that they were wanting to get from Germany. Russia itself was devastated, and right at the end of, when the war was ended, toward the end of, I think it was September, October of 45, or at least September, right after the war ended in the Pacific, they stopped Lend-Lease, okay? So a lot of that Lend-Lease by that time was a lot of foodstuffs and everything to keep starvation from happening in Russia. But Russia, this part of Russia over here, a lot of their industrial pre-war, they moved a lot of industry out to Siberia, but that whole area through there, through Ukraine and those areas that the war touched was just totally devastated on the way back. As the Russian armies advanced, the German army destroyed everything in their path to try to slow them down. And then all the countries down here, there was a lot of, with bombing and the fighting coming through there. So Europe was really in shock, and not just the German cities, it was a lot of countries. So the one thing that we had going to set up democracies was, the fact that we had liberated part of them, and then we were generous in aid. The UN set up a lot of aid programs, United Nations. The one thing that the Soviets didn't have going for them is when their armies came through and conquered a lot of that, they weren't very kind to the civilians. So they always had that as a negative in terms of trying to gain support for communist governments, at least initially. So one of the things that started you could say the Iron Curtain, is even as early as 46, some of our diplomats, where some of the money was flowing, some of the planning that was being made. And there was a guy by the name of Kennan, and he was a career diplomat, and he wrote a long paper basically on what was coming. And pretty well the crux of what he was saying is that if the U.S., if we don't start supporting and putting putting aid and doing just as much as the Soviet Union, all these countries are going to start putting in governments just like the USSR. And there wasn't any evidence based on how they were starting to do things that the ruthlessness and the lack of individual rights, whether that was going to be any different into how the USSR became its country. Okay, so one of the things in journalism, in papers, in things in the United Nations, the face of, what is communism versus capitalism, and in terms of what's better for the people in those countries, and a lot of tension in that respect. So the Hungarian elections in the fall of '45, the Soviets went in there and they did a lot of undermining of the actual, there was, quote, free elections, but everything was somewhat rigged. So Hungary in '45 was an example. And then once the communists got in power, it was pretty well a free-for-all in terms of getting rid of the opposition parties, leaders, and everything. So very cruel and a lot of people sent to prison or even sent to the Soviet Union. So if we've heard of Greece had a civil war around that time where they had communism versus the monarchists there, democracy on either side on the elections, and it spilled over into different violence. And it got bad enough that the British actually had to intervene with their Air Force and other troops, and they were able to. A lot of the communists there, they basically fled north into Yugoslavia. Okay. So all this was going on, and then Truman invited Winston Churchill. And remember, he wasn't prime minister at that time; he had been kicked out. And so he was spending his time writing his 5-volume set of what went on in World War II, okay? But he delivers a speech in Fulton, Missouri. You can actually go over there. It's a very interesting museum if you ever go over there. And he delivers a speech and really got into public the term Iron Curtain. So from these countries over here, these were neutral, okay? All the way down through the division line in Germany, and coming down through here, Turkey, Greece, Italy were considered on the western side, but that's the terminology of the Iron Curtain and what that meant. So at this time, after that, in '46, '47, the Soviet Union started putting a lot of pressure on Turkey. And so Turkey controls a very key portion of the world there that controls access to the Eastern Mediterranean, okay? And so you had the Greek Civil War there, and we had Soviet pressure on Turkey to give up some things, because you got to remember, Soviets still had a huge army. They still had a lot of influence. Even though they were devastated after the war, they were slowly recovering. So getting the Soviet Navy to get into the Mediterranean and be a somewhat equal partner there was not what both Britain and the U.S. wanted to do. So the British actually did some negotiation and really pleaded for the U.S. to start getting involved with Truman. Okay, one of the things that happened in the fall of '46, the House and Senate flipped. Okay, so Truman had to start paying attention to the people on the other side of the aisle that were a lot more conservative in terms of saying we got to do something about the Soviet Union. Okay. And they had politically common ground because Truman saw that also. And so what he did was saying, look, we have to support the free peoples from totalitarian regimes. And he He proposed in the Truman Doctrine, and what went along with that was 400 million, which is 5.7 billion today, in aid to Europe. And George Marshall was Secretary of State. If you remember, he was the head guy over the U.S. Army during World War II. And then Dean Acheson was his deputy. And Dean Acheson has a role to play later on in the 60s and 70s. And they championed the bill through Congress. One of the things that's interesting is the Truman Doctrine, and then we'll talk about the Marshall Plan later. They were one of the early events that, you know, with all the, you could say with World War II, yes, you had massive production going on, massive spending, more than we've ever done, even deficit spending and stuff. But that was all either building stuff for our Army and what we wanted to do, or it was Lend-Lease, and we were going to get paid back for that. This was one of the first examples of putting money and throwing it out into helping other countries to try to set up democracies. So it was I called it increasing clarity of the Western Allies against Soviet-sponsored states. So it really set the stage for having a dividing line of the Iron Curtain in Europe, especially. I'm doing it on time. Okay. So the Marshall Plan, that was even bigger, 13.3 billion. And what they saw was that the European states were not recovering from World War II with all the devastation. You've got economic problems. You even got psychological scars from the war. It's like, okay, you know, what's our options with Germany? Well, we can turn it into an agricultural state and not give them any industry or whatever. But they saw that having a strong Germany made sense and getting the Europe back on their feet was a bulwark against the Soviet, you know, from communism is the way they looked at it. But the Soviets pressured the East Bloc. It was offered to everybody in Europe, even even in Eastern Europe. But the Soviets pressured not to accept aid. If you accepted aid, then you were anti-USSR and everything that went with that. So this is one of the key steps of dividing Germany into East and West. Okay. And you can see the pictures here. This is a poster talking about the Marshall Plan. Over here, this is aid actually going to Greece. Different boxes of aid. It was both food and economic aid. So while all this was going on in Europe, and things solidifying into two sides there. What was going on in Asia? Well, so for the years right after the war, you had a Chinese civil war between the Chinese communists and Chiang Kai-shek. And in 1949, the nationalists lost, and they went to the island of Formosa, called Taiwan right now. And Mao Zedong, he was the leader of the Chinese communists, but China had went through a huge amount of devastation, lost a lot, huge amount of people during World War II, and then also during their Civil War. So it wasn't like, oh, the communists defeated they're all just as powerful as USSR. They weren't, okay? So this was called the Bamboo Curtain, okay? You can see where the different states here. India and Pakistan, they were neutral because they were breaking away from Great Britain. That happened during the war, but accelerated, definitely getting rid of the colonization there. One of the things that is an interesting part that explains a lot that happened later was getting rid of all the colonial influence, both from, you could say, some of the French territories, the Netherlands, the Dutch, different areas down here. But USSR and us, we oppose colonialism, but we supported whichever nationalist state that was leaning toward, and it doesn't matter who was running it. And a lot of times there weren't some very good characters running the states that we supported. And that was a trend in a lot of these areas. You could see it in some of the, in Vietnam, down there in what used to be Burma and everything, and even in Korea. Syngman Rhee in Korea, he wasn't, in terms of the heavy-handedness that they had, it wasn't like a lot of these. They were all democracies, just like the U.S., okay? Now, just real quick, talking about Japan, one of the things that we did was, and the Japanese basically soaked it up, turning into a democracy and everything, because all their history was a lot of, they still kept their emperor, but actually having a representative voice was a real big deal, and that accelerated during the after the war and through the 40s. So Japan, what I call it, democratization of Japan was going on there too. North and South Korea was split right after the war because couldn't agree on whether the North or the South, so okay, let's split it at the 38th parallel. And that's the way it was right after the Japanese left, okay? Now, we won't get into a whole lot, but France needed to, they wouldn't give up their colonialism in Vietnam, and to keep them as an ally, we reluctantly went along with that too. So that was, so there was a whole story to tell about that, okay? But that's what things look like in Asia. And this was, through the late 40s. So as you see, all across the globe, there was a split between USSR sponsored states and communism, and on our side, the capitalism pushed toward democracy, but both sides supported different regimes that had their issues too. Okay, can't talk Cold War without the A-bomb. Okay, so obviously we had the atomic weapons at the end of the war. You had the two bombs dropped to end the war with Japan. Okay, but during that Manhattan Project, the Soviets had plenty of spies while it was being developed and everything. I got a picture of some of the more famous ones there, the Rosenbergs. Now they didn't I think that arrest photo was in the early 50s, but a lot of historians pretty well say it wasn't, the spies didn't, if there wasn't any spying, would the Soviets not have gotten the atomic bomb? The answer was they still would have got it, but it accelerated by 2 to 3 years, most likely. Now, and then an interesting tidbit is, the British and even the French, they were behind the U.S., and there was very little nuclear technology sharing. So one of the big things that, the British felt they obviously needed to be a nuclear power, and they had a lot of trial and error in the 40s and 50s before finally getting it. Soviets had their first test in 49. So, this is actually a picture of the Trinity test in the U.S. of the first bomb right there. Now, the U.S., by the Soviets' first test there, we were working on perfecting the next level, the hydrogen bomb. And I believe our H-bomb first test there was, I believe, 52. Okay, so as we move forward into the time before the Korean War, or the Korean tragedy, you could call it that, because it didn't need to happen. One of the things that really increased polarity in Europe, the coup in Czechoslovakia. So that was Czechoslovakia. That was one of the reasons, World War II happened also, because you had, and actually after the war, you had Beneš as the prime minister there of Czechoslovakia, who was there before, and there was direct influence of the Soviet Union on that election, basically. And that was a wake-up call, and really a lot of protest in Norway, Netherlands, a lot of the smaller countries. Hey, if it can happen there, it can happen in our country. And like I said, it really polarized things in terms of this is what we're trying to stop from their point of view. So the Comintern had supposedly went away, but it was resurrected as the Cominform, the Communist Information Bureau. So they put out a lot of propaganda, just like we did, but they used that as doing some of the same things that the Comintern had done before in terms of doing subversion of different things, trying to support the local Communist Party in a lot of these places, and being just as ruthless as what the USSR was when they were forming. But one of the things that that happened in the late 40s was that the United Nations started being maybe a tool to show the world the difference between being a communist state and a democratic state. So the United Nations aid programs across the world. So one of the things is that the U.S. really put a lot of money into the United Nations. So along with the Marshall Plan and the Truman Doctrine, we did put a lot of money into the United Nations. Now, if you recognize this person right there, that's Eleanor Roosevelt. One of her big things that she championed after being First Lady was a Declaration of Human Rights. And why is that important? Well, that is important because from a philosophical point of view, individual rights is important, okay? And it's not the individual is subservient to the state, which is a lot of the fundamentals of communism. So that was seen as a victory. And then there's a couple of very good documentaries about that. That's definitely worth watching. So that got put in there, and that was a good thing there. Now one of the things that then you say, well, why do we have to have a Berlin airlift? The USSR pretty well blockaded East and West Germany. And that was monetary policy. So what we ended up doing was saying, look, we got to continue to get West Germany going again with its industry and have it actually recover. So one of the things we did is we redid the Deutschmark, tied it to the US dollar, and started introducing it at. And the Soviets is like, we can't have that, because then that made the money they were using in East German virtually worthless. And the reason they blockaded it is because they didn't want people coming over with their Deutschmarks, buying things there on their side, and then devaluating their monetary system. So they went ahead and put up barbed wire, closed the borders, and closed off Berlin, and saying, look, okay, well, they let us, they were going to either starve Berlin out or trying to figure out who was going to fold. So that's when the airlift came in, and that airlift went for, I think it was a good almost a year and a half. Let me look at my notes here. It started in June 48 and went until September 49. And that was pretty well, you can look at it from looking back on things, it was a failure. It was an abject failure of the USSR, because they were in no sense going to sit there and shoot down planes. Okay, they didn't want to start a war there, and basically we just had enough resources that we kept Berlin fed and basically kept that airlift up until they allowed traffic by land. Now it was regulated and everything, but then they allowed food to come in. So that's the way on the Berlin airlift. And it was a massive effort, lots of planes, and it just showed the world what the U.S. and the Allied powers could do. So that's that's pretty well what was going on from a political military point of view leading up to right before Korea. Now, talking just a little bit about, well, what were some of the reasons the Korean War started? Well, Syngman Rhee, he was the he was the the president or leader of South Korea, and then you got Kim Il Sung, who was the leader of North Korea, and both of them wanted unified Korea. Okay, just in different ways, obviously. So by this time in the late 40s, you could say Stalin was a little more paranoid, megalomaniac, and everything, and he gave the green light for Kim Il Sung to invade, because it was only going to be, maybe at the most 6 weeks. That's usually the standard for anybody that wants to, seems like, start a war will be over in a few weeks. So you could say from that point of view that, the Korean War was definitely started with the green light from Moscow. And one of the reasons they said, well, yeah, go ahead, you've got China as a backup. And China really wasn't too thrilled about being put in that position, but it's like, well, we need to, do what our big brother says, basically, at that point, because they had just won their civil war and they were recovering, and the Soviet Union was giving them a lot of aid, and most of the equipment was for the North Koreans, obviously, was Soviet. So that's where we are at the beginning of the Korean War. But things during the decade of the 50s, the H-bomb was developed. Stalin dies, Nikita Khrushchev takes over. Okay, they actually denounce Stalin to the people and do de-Stalinization, you could say, with some of that. We get McCarthyism in the 50s, really recognizing and having the Red Scare, and obviously having the spies in the Manhattan Project didn't help on that either. Soviets with Sputnik, that was a big deal. Now, it wasn't just putting satellites up there. Obviously, if you can put a satellite up there, you've broken that ground to be able to develop missiles to do other things with missiles too. So that was another layer of escalation there. We had the big Air Force, but they were starting to get ahead of us on the missiles. And then Fidel Castro comes into power, in the late 50s. So a lot of things going on. Hopefully, this is pretty well what I want to talk about. And if there's any questions, but hopefully that gives you sort of a sense of the separation in ideologies that happened, that had its root, back in the mid-1800s with Das Kapital and Karl Marx, and it worked its way into a place that was ripe for a revolution, and then that was the origin of the USSR. And at the end of World War II, they were a massive power, we were a massive power, and just that differences in government and how people wanted to live, that led to that conflict and continued forward all the way to, the mid-90s. So, any questions? Be happy to try to answer them.
At the beginning of World War II, Finland was invaded by Russia.
Yes.
They, I understand Russia did take over a portion of Finland's property. Did Finland ever get it back?
No. What actually was, they had it back for a period of time. So during the main parts of that area that was part of their negotiation during the Winter War in 1939, 1941, whenever Nazi Germany invaded and Finland got on the side of Germany, they took those areas back. And then in 1944, whenever Russia negotiated another peace with them, I'm pretty sure most of that they lost most of that again. So I think most of where the line is today is that divided up section that was from the peace treaty in, I think it was September 44 that they negotiated. And Finland never was invaded, conquered by Russia. They were able to stop the war and say, look, you know, and there were some things that Finland didn't do during the war that allowed them to negotiate, because they could have attacked Leningrad from the other side, and they refused to do that kind of thing.
Excellent presentation, Mike. Thank you very much. Are there any lessons that you can see from that period that you can move forward to right now? Things that we should be thinking about?
Well, I would say one thing is trying to understand if you're in a different spot with another country in terms of how you know, it's a lot about power, a lot about economic power, but you need to understand who you're dealing with. And I think a lot of times how us as people get our information, you want to watch where whichever journalist or story or whatever, they tend to describe a situation like they were describing something in the U.S., but it's China, you know, and we tend to think everybody is just like us in terms of rights and legal, you know, the legal protections and all that kind of stuff. And I would say one of the lessons is that there is still big divisions in ideologically, or whatever you call that. And you have to realize that we sort of have you know, the democracies that, you know, U.S. and the European democracies were a little different, but it is a lot different than, you know, Russia currently, China currently, a lot of other countries. And it's easy to describe something going on in those countries, and then in our head we think, oh yeah, that seems reasonable, but they're in a totally different framework, I guess, if that makes sense. I mean, that's... So is that good on time, I think, right?
All right. Great, thank you so much.